You can try this at home if you'd like to. Walk up to people like this. What am I doing? What am I doing? All right, so number one is experiment with your lens. And when I say that, it's taking whatever lenses that you have and it's working the angle. There's a difference between getting close with a wide angle lens and standing back with a telephoto lens, partially because of the optical characteristics of telephoto versus wide angle. But all of these different points of view have an impact on how the image gets constructed. So get in close, move far back, change the subject of the composition, provide certain contexts or environments, and then select the depth of field to best suit the subject. So if we go back just for 1 second here, you'll also notice that she's in focus and her hands are out of focus, correct? Now I could have changed the aperture to increase the depth of field to try to get everything in focus, but that actually isn't the way that we see. So it looks much more natural to have certain things in focus and other things out of focus. Now just to sort of go through a range here of focal lengths and discuss that aspect. So here is a little series of photographs. The first one taken at 18 millimeters, and then what I did is I slowly zoomed in 35 millimeters, 75, 150, 200, and then finally 270. So having a lens, in this case the 18 to 270, which has a 15 times optical zoom, and for anyone that really cares, when somebody talks about the power of a zoom, it's basically simple math. You take the wide angle number and you divide it into the telephoto number, and whatever number that is how powerful the zoom is. So now you know. All these years I'm sure you've wanted to know that, and now you do. So 18 goes into 270 15 times, so this is a 15 times optical zoom. And you have this entire range, so this image obviously has a different impact and feel and context than that image. So everything you choose to include. Or if you wanted to take that 270 and focus anywhere else in the scene, think about the hundreds of pictures that are possibilities, and you're making the decision when you click the shutter what's in the frame and how you frame it up. But having the ability to go through this whole range with one lens gives you more options. So this being super wide angle lens, right? And this being super telephoto. So here, 11 millimeters to 500 millimeters, having a different impact and shooting different things. And then, of course, there's also macro. Now with macro, you're really, in general, close to your subject. And with true macro lenses, like a 60 millimeter or a 90 or a 180 millimeter lens, you can get actual one-to-one macro magnification, which is pretty cool. So take advantage of this macro ability too. So the proximity you are to your subject and the focal length you're using. Now I want to talk briefly about a couple of functions that lens technology can enhance. One of them has to do with the angle of view of the actual lens. So for example, having something that goes from 18 millimeters to 270 millimeters, a 15 times zoom in one convenient little package, something about this size or so. And so having that ability with one lens means A, you don't have to change lenses, and B, you can carry around something convenient and light. And maybe you're the type of person that likes to take all of your gear with you all the time, or if you're like me, I prefer that someone else carries it and I just could use what I want. Anyway, so then you're also dealing with the minimum focusing distance of a lens. And the minimum focusing distance of a lens controls how much magnification that it ultimately has. So for example, many lenses like this lens right here, which is the 18 to 270, has a macro feature. So if any of you have zoom lenses that say macro on them, it means that in general it's going to be at the most telephoto focal length, so in this case 270 millimeters, and you're going to be at whatever the minimum focusing distance of the lens. In this case it's about 1.5 feet. So once you're at that distance, that's going to give you the most macro capability that your lens has. Now by photo industry standards, any lens that gives you 1:4 magnification or quarter life size or greater can be called a macro lens. And true macro lenses give you 1:1 magnification. Another technology example is VC. That's Tamron stabilization, which is in almost all of their lenses at this point. And what stabilization does in any lens allows you to hand hold an image at a slower shutter speed than used to be possible. And basically what it does is it detects movement, and in detecting the movement, it counteracts whatever your action is as the photographer and allows you to be able to get clearer pictures. Now, what the stabilizer doesn't do is if you have low light and a moving subject, it doesn't freeze action any better. And if you have it on a tripod, it can actually create blur. So it's recommended by every manufacturer currently that you would turn that switch off, which is why they give you an option to turn it off. So long exposures on a tripod, shut it off. Other than that, you can pretty much leave it on all the time. If you have faster shutter speeds, it simply won't impact it, but it's that marginal somewhere between a second and eighth of a second in that range where hand holding it with this is really valuable. An example of that. So here I am in Times Square, on the edge of the street, not really able to put a tripod down. Also, the traffic's moving, everything is kind of crazy. It's Times Square. You've all been there, right? Or at least seen it, heard of it, maybe? Okay. Anyway, this was with the 28 to 300 millimeter lens at 42 millimeters, and it was handheld at a sixth of a second. Now, the traditional rule is that you take one and you put it over the focal length that you're using. That's the slowest shutter speed that you want to use. So, for example, if you have a lens that's 28 to 300 millimeters, at 28 millimeters, you want to be at about a 30th of a second. Any slower than that, the chances of you moving while the picture is being taken and creating blur, it starts to get pretty high. But as you zoom your lens to, say, 300 millimeters, now you have to be at about a 300th of a second, or 250th, let's say. Because what happens is as you zoom, you magnify, and it magnifies everything, including your movement. I'm sure you've all had this experience before where, if you look through a telescope or something, that has a very high magnification, the slightest movement can create that shake. So the same goes with photography. And if you have a stabilizer, however, it gives you, in the case of the Tamron VC, about 4 additional stops. So that would mean if you were hand holding this image at, let's say, at 42 millimeters, so we'll say a 40th of a second, that you would be able to go to a 20th of a second, that would be one stop. Then a 10th of a second would be another stop. And then a 5th of a second would be another stop. And then beyond that would be about a half a second. So you should be able to hand hold between a half a second and a sixth of a second, with presuming there's no major movement. So it can really help on those marginal low light situations. All right, the next thing I want to discuss has to do with understanding depth of field. Now, depth of field is controlled by several different factors. One of the things that it is controlled, the depth of field, has to do with the focal length of the lens you're using. So, for example, a 24 millimeter lens has more depth of field than a 300 millimeter lens. So that's the first factor. The second factor has to do with the actual aperture you're using. Apertures that are wider apertures that let more light in have numbers like 3.5 or 2.0 or something like that. Those are larger, they let more light in, and the consequence of that is that there's less depth of field. So that's the second factor. And then the third factor has to do with the distance that you are physically focusing from your subject. So for example, if I'm using a 300 millimeter lens and I'm really close to my subject and I'm wide open at, whatever, f5.6 or something on my lens, that's going to give me a very narrow depth of field. The same lens at infinity, even wide open, would give you everything in focus. So the distance that you're physically focused is one thing, the actual f-stop you're using, and then the focal length. Those are the three factors. So we'll just give you some examples isolating some of those factors. So on the left-hand side, you can see how there's more blur in the background, right? Because you're using that lens 2.8 wide open. And here at 22, you have more depth of field. Now, sometimes having more depth of field, especially for a lot of landscape photography, is desirable. A lot of times for portraits, you want your subject to be sharp, but the background to be a little bit softer. And so most of the time people are shooting portraits, they're somewhere in this f8, f5.6, f11 aperture wise, because you want to be able to see the background, but you don't want it to be as sharp as the subject. This way the subject pops off of the background. So if you use even any program mode of your camera, if you could put it in portrait mode or landscape mode or whatever, what it's doing is it knows this information and it's trying to bias it towards, based on how much light there is, all of these factors. So in the case of landscape, give you more depth of field. In the case of portrait, give you a little bit less and isolate your subject. So we'll give you another example of that. Here's an image taken at f22 and then f2.8. So there's a pretty big difference in terms of the impact of this picture versus the impact of that picture. And if you're aware of this is how it works, then you would make these choices based upon the visual effect that you're trying to create. So those wider apertures blur out the background significantly more. Here's another example. This is taken with the 28 to 75 millimeter lens, wide open at 2.8 aperture, and at 75 millimeters, and at maybe almost the minimum focusing distance. So you can see that the depth of field is pretty small. Like the grass in the front is out of focus, then you get like the nose and the eye in focus, and then behind that, everything else out of focus. Now sometimes, if you put the focus in the right place, it can be desirable, because if everything's in focus, you as the viewer aren't really sure what the most important thing is. Here it's pretty clear that what exactly you should be looking at based upon what's physically in focus. Here's another example, also with that same lens, where when I took this image, I shot first the one with his face in focus, but then the foreground just looked a bit odd. And in fact, this picture was really more about that specific gesture. So that's where the focus was on the second one, and it's much more successful. Like clearly there's enough information for you to determine who that character is. If you needed to say, well, whether or not you know them, you can clearly make out all the features, so it's not faceless, but at the same time the focus being on that gesture in the foreground. Now to do this from a really extreme angle, if you get super close and you're wide open, and especially if you're photographing children because they're smaller physically, then that means in order to fill the frame you have to physically get closer, and the consequence of that is less depth of field. So here, this is with the 28 to 75 at 75 millimeters, 2.8 wide open, and extremely close to that subject, and so literally the entire face isn't in focus. It's just the eyes. Now the other reason is because the way that it works is it's all with respect to this particular plane, right? This is the plane of where your chip is. Now your minimum focusing distance is always measured from this little icon here, which is a circle with a line, and I'm pretty sure every single one of you has this on their camera, even if they never knew that it was there. So if you look for it now, you'll know that's exactly where your chip is, and when they measure the minimum focusing distance of your lens, it's always measured from that point. It's not the front of the lens. So with that said, if you get really physically close to someone this way, and we have a small depth of field, if I'm parallel to his face, then his eyes and his lips will all be in focus. As soon as I change the angle, well, now the angle's here. So that's what's happening in this photo. So her eyes are in focus, her chin's out. If I was parallel to her face, then that's the way that depth of field works. Very thin. Here's another example. This is using a macro lens, a true 1-to-1 macro lens. In this case, it's the 90 macro. I actually have this stopped all the way down to f16, so you would think that it's selectively depth. There's like not a lot of focus there, but once you get physically so close to something, using a true macro lens, even to maintain a little bit of focus, sometimes requires you to stop down. So that's at f16 using the true 1-to-1 macro. And then at the other extreme, this is 11 millimeters, and here, because we're already focused at infinity, that you have everything in focus. So again, using wider angle lenses gives you more depth of field. Getting really close to your subject gives you less depth of field. All right, this brings us to number 3, which is understanding the field of view. There are always these relationships in images between things, and everything that you choose to put in the frame is actually important information. So it may not be something that you cognitively, consciously consider when you're composing an image, but if you start to think about it or look at it later, you might say, well, it would have been better if I had this out or this. So when you're actually out there taking pictures and you're physically engaging with whatever you're photographing, be conscious of what's going in the frame, because that's the information that winds up ultimately getting conveyed. So, the image on the left-hand side, clearly there's enough information so you realize where that is, where an isolated part of it, maybe not so much, but you can't always tell. Like, for example, the sky there is a little bit washed out just because of the day. So sometimes you say, well, rather than try to get everything, I'll just isolate and get one specific thing. All right, here's an example. This was with the 70 to 200 2.8 here in New York at Fashion Week a couple of years ago. This is at 200 millimeters and cropping out everything except for like the dresses and the arms in the final part of the runway show. Now, it would have been possible, obviously, to use a different focal lens and then be able to see all of the models on the runway, but somehow by just isolating a specific part, sometimes it makes a little bit more impact in the image. Another example of something like that, where you're just taking a part of something and representing it for the whole. So you don't always have to show everything to get enough information to know what the photograph is of. And sometimes the idea of less being more is also a great way to be able to convey stories. So because of the mood, because of the fog, because of this, it just isolates one specific simple thing that normally gets crowded by all of these other things. So it makes it simple and a very clear sort of statement. So understanding that field of view also has some relationship to the lens that you use. So this, for example, is with the 10 to 24 millimeter at 10 millimeters. So, this is in Brooklyn at the Botanical Gardens, cherry blossoms and whatnot. So 10 millimeters, it starts to, it's the branches in this case are what sort of break up just this field of flowers, where if you focus on a specific one, then it becomes more about a specific blossom than the whole tree of blossoms. So you get a different mood and a different feel just depending on what you put into the frame. Another example here, for some people that were here earlier before, probably know what's coming, but here's the 270 millimeter end of the 18 to 270, isolating just part of the Brooklyn Bridge. If that's what you choose to take, that's fine, but then you wouldn't have thought that there would have been someone standing right in front of you at 18 millimeters. So one image, is taken from the exact same place, but think about all of the possibilities of, 270 millimeter pictures all in just that space. So whatever you choose to put in the frame really, really matters. Next, we're going to go to secret 4.